Hi, my name's HMO and today we're going to be talking about HMOs. What are HMOs? What sort of tenants you would put in a HMO? Where is the best areas to generally have a HMO? Some of the pros and cons of a HMO and some regulations. So, what is a HMO? It's a house of multiple occupants or a multi-let. Now, the HMO is classed up to 7 people, where you rent out up to 7 different rooms, or rather you rent out rooms for up to 7 different people because you might have 2 people in one room. So it's say where you take a 3-bedroom house which has 2 receptions and a kitchen and a bathroom, and you would take it and you would turn the 3 bedrooms into bedrooms. You would turn 1 reception room into the 4th bedroom, and then you have a communal living area and a kitchen, and you would rent out those 4 bedrooms to 4 individual tenants. So the type of tenants you might have in a HMO are students or working professionals. Now, the general working professional you might get is people which have a high turnaround. So generally you would get hospital staff which work on different hospitals on placements for a year or so, and they are going between hospitals and hospitals. Or you might get some working professionals who are doing placements in different areas. For example, a 1-year gap year in a student, they might become a working professional for 1 year, working in a company before they go back to become a student. So these tenants you would be looking for. There are other types. Anyone can be a occupancy of a HMO, but those are the 2 general ones that you would be looking for. So where would you want a HMO? Well, the best areas for HMO are near universities, near town centres, near hospitals, or anywhere where you have a big turnaround of people who are not planning to stay there long term. Because generally if they're planning to stay longer term, then they're going to be looking more for a 1-bedroom flat or a studio apartment rather than a shared house. So you would be looking ideally between, if you have a university and a hospital which are within 10 minutes of each other, you would look ideally directly between the 2. And you would also want it near to a town centre if possible. Why would you use a HMO? Well, the reason you would use a HMO is because when you let out the rooms individually, you'll increase your rent. For example, on a 3-bedroom house with 2 reception rooms, you might be looking at a £700 per calendar month rental income. You might be looking at less, you might be looking at more. It depends what area the property's in, how much you paid for it and how high the rental demand is. But if you turn it into a HMO and you put 4 tenants in there, you might be able to rent each room out for £400 each, which means you'd be making £1,600 net profit. Now with a HMO you do have to pay bills. So you would be liable for council tax unless you have students in there. Students are council tax exempt, so if you have students you don't need to pay council tax. If you have working professional, you are liable for council tax. You would be liable for bills in general, not always, but it makes it a lot easier for tenants so they don't have arguments. That's why you would normally include bills. And obviously maintenance, if there's anything that needs fixing or repairing, painting, decorating, all of this stuff, you're likely to get a higher wear and tear on a HMO than on a standard let house, 3-bedroom house. So when you let this property, you're going to have these things to take into consideration. Now they vary. It depends on the area, on the council tax, on general bands, but you would say that it was a minimum of £400 per calendar month as bills for a 4-bed, and you go up as the price if the amount of bedrooms goes up, obviously the cost would go up, but you would be looking at maybe £500 if you need a licence per calendar month as an approximate ballpark figure of what your bills are likely to cost. So you would take that off your £1,600 and you would end up with £1,100. Now £1,100 is quite a lot more than your £700 you would be letting it as a 3-bedroom house. The only other thing you would need to consider if you were letting it as a HMO or multi-let property is that you would need a mains linked fire alarm system, and and you would need fire doors and fire safety regulations. There may be different things you need in your area, such as minimum room sizes, minimum communal areas, but in general, the only things you really need to consider is fire doors and fire alarm system. Everything else would have to be checked with the local council to make sure you comply. The issues with a HMO. Well, one issue with having a HMO is licensing or planning permission. To get a license is reasonably easy. All you have to do is make sure the property is up to standard and that it actually meets the local regulations for the council's requirement for a multi-let property. But if it is a house, to convert it into a multi-let property, you would have to check for Article 4 areas. Now you can check that with your local council. They would happily tell you, if you tell them the postcode and a house number, they would happily tell you whether it's in an Article 4 area and whether it's in a conservation area. And if it isn't, then under permitted development rights you'd be allowed to change it to a house of multiple occupants as long as you comply with their rules amongst the house requirements for a HMO. So the biggest disadvantage of a HMO, or the biggest difficulty with a HMO, is making sure that you're allowed to run it as a HMO legally, because you don't want to go and do some of these illegal things landlords are doing, because quite often, as I've read in the news today, someone has been fined £12,000 which they've had to pay back to their tenants for the last few years that their tenants have stayed in the property. So you don't want to be in that scenario. You would rather make sure you're up to spec and you've done everything legally and properly. So to summarise, the best things about having a HMO is higher rental income. So you can maximise the rental income from the property by turning it into a HMO. That's the biggest advantage of having a HMO. The disadvantages, there's a few disadvantages, but you'd have to weigh up whether that outweighs your advantages. The main disadvantage is high tenant turnaround. So you're likely to have more tenants in the property which either stay for a year, sometimes less, sometimes they stay for the whole academic period that they're in if you have students. But you have high tenant turnaround, which means high maintenance, you have to pay for the bills, you have to look after multiple tenants, so there's more likely to be issues between individual tenants. These are all things to consider. So if you like this video, subscribe to my channel, click the bell notification icon to get notified of the next video coming out, and keep up to date with all areas of property industry.